Simon Hankinson, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Great to be with you.
So you are the Senior Research Fellow in the Border Security and Immigration Center at the Heritage Foundation. What does that mean? What is your job?
Well, it's sort of evolved over the time that I've been there. I was a Foreign Service officer with the State Department from 1999, and I retired out of Nairobi in 2022 on a Friday and went to work at Heritage on a Monday. Our center was fairly new then, only a couple months old, and they staffed up from one, and I was the first senior research fellow. So I kind of had to invent the job with the guidance of my boss and others who've been doing similar work. And it's turned out to be a mix of writing, media, public events, punditry, let's call it writ large. So I write a weekly column called The Borderline in the Daily Signal, which is Heritage's media outlet. I do quite a bit of local radio, TV. I do occasional national TV as well. I do things like this. This afternoon, I'm speaking to a group of high school interns. I speak to college students, high school students. We do seminars, public events. So it's quite a mix of things, and to some extent, it's what I make of it.
What is the current state of immigration in the U.S.? It's a giant political issue. And it's not just in the U.S., it's around the world. There's a concern that we have essentially enormous amounts of people coming into the country illegally. Paint the picture for me about what's actually happening from your perspective based on the data you've got access to and your work.
Well, what we have now is an unmitigated man-made disaster. And I say man-made because it was deliberate policies of this administration that created not necessarily the source of the problem, but the flow and the speed and the rapidity of it. And it's unmitigated in the sense that the president has elected not to use his executive powers to end it. I don't think no president could ever 100% seal the border so that no one ever got in illegally. But if you take the average number of people that showed up were encountered at the border illegally under previous administrations, it might average 50,000 in a bad year, and now we're looking at 250,000 a month. So it is a chaotic, uncontrolled situation. Unfortunately, there's no bipartisan will to pass any kind of legislation that would control the border. You've got just completely opposing views right now. I think the leftward part of the Democratic Party is running immigration policy for them, and I think the Republican Party generally has soured on compromise because they've had it force fed to them for 3.5 years. This wreckage at the border. So I've never seen it politically as ugly as it is today. The root causes of migration really haven't changed all that much in my lifetime. There's more people, for sure. The population's grown. But it's not as if, Latin America or Asia or Africa were ever, well governed universally, or as if there were never hurricanes and floods and other natural disasters. So I think the sort of natural conditions haven't changed as much as the policies of the politicians in charge.
All right, here's your obligatory reminder to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. It really actually does help us out a lot. When we're trying to book awesome new guests, they look at how many subscribers are on the channel and they say, yep, this is worth doing. And I want to bring the best possible people to you that I can. Speaking of which, let's get back to the conversation. And what exactly has changed? Because I don't believe there's been any legislation to pass that changed things between the prior administration and this one. So how can we go? What is the actual things that have changed that would lead 50,000, did you say per year, to?
I believe it was 50,000. I mean, I could get you exact numbers, but it might be, about 50,000 a year. We were seeing, a few thousand a month showing up, maybe a dozen a day. But now we're seeing thousands per day, sometimes up to 10,000 a month and, a day. And over 250. I think the worst month was like 350,000 back in December of 2023.
So really help me understand what policy change would lead to such a monumental increase. I mean, that is a staggering increase. It doesn't seem like just the executive branch's policies. Like, what does that mean?
Well, I mean, there's an absolute clear line between the policies of the Biden administration in particular and the numbers that we're seeing. So I'll give you some examples. Previous presidents in the past, I've worked for Republicans and Democrats in my career. There was a fairly universal agreement that the job of the executive branch, they swore an oath to defend and uphold the Constitution, and that means enforcing the laws. And there was disagreement about what those laws should be. There were always Democrats who were pushing for amnesties, occasionally Republicans too, for political reasons. You had Republicans, some of them, particularly the libertarian side, the sort of Chamber of Commerce people wanting higher numbers of legal immigrants to do jobs that they needed filled. But no one really debated that you had to try to enforce the laws that were in place. Occasionally that got difficult because there would be a rush at the border for one reason or another. You had the Mariel crisis with the Cubans. You've had Haiti, unfortunately, melts down about every decade on schedule. But the Clinton administration, the Carter administration, even the Obama administration, by and large, did not believe that they had the ability to waive law and allow everybody into the country. Obama famously said, it's not as if I can wave a magic wand and change the law. I have to follow the law the way it's written. President Trump, when he was faced with a surge at the border, enacted some policies that took away the sort of immediate benefit that people coming to the border illegally want. And you have to remember that of the population that shows up at the border, the vast majority are there for a job. They live in countries that are less wealthy than the U.S., where there are fewer opportunities, maybe bad government, and they want to come here and get a job. You can't blame them for wanting that. Very few of them are actually fleeing for reasons that would allow them political asylum under our law, which is based on the Geneva Convention of 1951. So when you have people showing up, what do they want? They want to get in to the country. They want to be able to stay. They want to be able to send money home. They want to be able to work. And then they want to bring their families to join them. They want those 5 things. So if you give them those 5 things, word gets out and they're going to come and stay. And they don't really care about the mechanics of it, the policies, the asylum process. What matters to people coming for economic reasons is, can they get in, work, stay, send money home, and eventually send for their families? So the Trump administration made an effort to send the signal out that, yes, of course, our laws haven't changed and people can claim asylum under certain circumstances, but we are not going to release every single person who shows up and says that they're fleeing political persecution into the country, into a backlog that's now upwards of 3 million cases that could last 10, 15 years before a decision is made. And even when it's made, they're unlikely to be deported because by that time they've got kids and roots, and there'll be multiple appeals. And we know that once people are released into the country, the percentage that are deported, even with a valid order from a judge, plummets down from like 98% if they're detained down to 20% for individuals and as low as 2% for unaccompanied children. So the Trump administration enacted something called Remain in Mexico. The migrant, it wasn't called Remain in Mexico, it's called the Migrant Protection Protocols, but people know it as Remain in Mexico. And what that said was, if you come to the border illegally and you claim asylum, you say, I can't go home to Venezuela or Cameroon because I will be persecuted by the government. We said, okay, you can lodge your application and we'll let you go through with it. You'll have your day in court and your hearing, but you have to wait in Mexico outside the United States until we decide your case. Because if we let you in, then you've already got the 5 things you want, and then you might not bother to show up for the second hearing. And that happens all the time. People come in under the pretext of claiming for asylum. claiming asylum. They are released into the country. I call it process, parole, and punt. And they're released into the Mayorkas migration machine. They get a ticket to go to New York or Chicago or L.A. They get a notice to appear in court, maybe a month, 3 months, 6 months down the line. Half of them don't bother to show up to that first hearing because they've already got what they wanted and they know they don't really have an asylum claim. Some of them bother to show up for the first hearing, but then not the second or the third, or they keep showing up until it becomes obvious that they're not going to win their case, and then they stop showing up. And sometimes they even show up for the final case. The judge says, you're ordered removed, and they say, thank you very much, and then they go home, and no one ever comes to pick them up to remove them. There are 7.4 million cases on ICE's, this is Immigration and Customs Enforcement's, non-detained docket. That means people in deportation proceedings who are just running around the country perfectly happy, working, doing whatever it is they want to do. So, this system has been overwhelmed. The legal immigration system and the asylum system have just been crushed by a wave of economic migrants because President Biden undid the migrant protection protocols. He said, stop building the wall. He said, I will not detain children. I will release everybody. So you had family groups showing up with children. You had the same children being recycled, several times through the system.
There
was no effort really.
Stop. Go back for a sec. When you say children being recycled through the system, what do you mean by that?
Well, at one point, they were doing DNA tests. I worked overseas doing visa interviews, and the fraud level is unbelievably high. People would show up and say, this is my kid. And if you did a DNA test, it was one way to be sure that they were or they weren't. And just the mere threat that you're going to do a DNA test will convince some people it's not worth, wasting the time and taking the gamble. But they stopped doing that. So you would have a so-called family show up. And now some of them actually were mother, father, kid. But sometimes it was an uncle or a cousin or just a relative that the cartel would put together into a package because there's a court decision called Flores. It's kind of a long story, but it means that the government cannot detain children for longer than about 21 days. And if you're traveling with a child, the same judge that decided that in 2015 said anyone who's a family member or traveling with that child gets into that package, so they're released in 21 days. So it became a huge incentive to travel with a child. And there are many instances of Customs and Border Protection or Border Patrol recognizing a kid and saying, wait a minute, I just saw that kid 2 days ago. And so that's what I mean by recycling. I wouldn't say that's a majority of cases, but it definitely happens. Child trafficking is one of the easiest ways to get into the United States.
What happens to these children who are packaged together with either family members or even non-family members? I mean, the mind goes quickly to pretty dark places when you talk about kids that are being used as a tool.
Well, if the children are coming in with their actual families, then you would hope that the families are going to take care of them through whatever immigration processes they go through. There's a court decision in the U.S. that says that all public schools have to basically accept all children regardless of immigration status. So the kids, and they'll get federal health care benefits and various other things. So the ones that come in legitimate families, at least from a health and welfare point of view, are probably fine. The ones who are much more vulnerable are those who come in as minors, the so-called UACs, unaccompanied alien children. And I think so far the number under President Biden is it's approaching 500,000. So we're talking about 500,000 unaccompanied children. Some of them, a few of them, are actually over 18 and just claiming to be under 18. Let's say they're gang members from MS-13 or Tren de Aragua, and they want to get in under the easier regime. We've seen that happening. But a lot of them are actually minors. And what happens is they go into if they are from contiguous countries, so that's Mexico and Canada, they can be expelled. They can be removed just like adults. But if they are from anywhere further south, there's nowhere further north of Canada on this continent, but if they're from Central America, Venezuela, Colombia, then they are released into the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement. And this agency is originally, is still in charge of actual refugee resettlement, meaning people who've gone through the actual formal American refugee process overseas, and then they try to give them a head start, housing, hook them up in the neighborhood and get them on their way to becoming Americans. But they've kind of been shoehorned into this responsibility because no one else was able to take it on. And they essentially release these children to ideally a family member. But if they can't find one, then just some adult to whom the kid claims to have some kind of relationship. And unfortunately, some of those relationships are not good. We're talking about kids working in meat packing plants, prostitution, backbreaking labor that our law forbids, maybe to pay off the loan that their families took out to get them here, or for other nefarious purposes. So what's happening to the unaccompanied children is one of the sadder results of this border crisis.
I want to take a step back and hear how you paint the bigger picture of immigration in America, more from a historical perspective. So, we met a while, earlier this year, and we were talking about this issue, and and I tend to be more like pro-immigration. You could say I'm a delusional libertarian type, but aren't we a nation of immigrants? Isn't this just America being America, and send us your unwashed masses and all of that? Like, isn't letting even in sheer volume numbers, isn't this just like what happened at Ellis Island at the turn of the century, where you have boats filled with Italians and Irish and et cetera, et cetera? Place what's happening now in the bigger context of the history of immigration in America.
Well, I had a slide on this for one of the presentations that I give, and I wish I could remember the exact figure. But the number that came into Ellis Island per day was significantly smaller than the number that's coming in illegally now over the border per day. And if you look at the entire number that came in to Ellis Island over all the years that it was open, I believe it's fewer than were encountered at the border just under the Biden administration alone. So, the population of the world in, let's say, 1880 was less than half of what it is now. You couldn't just get on a plane and fly to Nicaragua and walk your way up to the U.S. border. So the mechanics of immigration are much, much easier. The populations of I'll just give you an example. My grandmother was born in India, and when she was born, the population of India was about 300 million people. And now the population of India is about 1.5 billion people. So it's gone up by 5 times. I've been there. It's a wonderful country in many ways, but it is full. You see people living in ways that no American would ever contemplate living. I remember getting up at 5:30 in the morning once to catch a train out of New Delhi, and lining the railroad tracks going out for about 2 miles were people taking their morning dump because that was the only place they could go. Like every 5 feet, there was someone squatting down. And I just thought, wow, this is a really crowded city. So the demographics of the world have changed enormously. And while I absolutely, I think everybody on my side of this debate who's in favor of enforcing the laws agrees that immigration is a part of U.S. history and a part of our future and is by and large a good thing for the country. We also accept the reality that the demand for entry into the U.S. exceeds the supply. And, I think I love drinking wine, and sometimes I drink too much. But if you have a glass of wine or a couple glasses at dinner, that's probably just fine. But if you have 2 or 3 bottles at breakfast, that long term is going to catch up with you. And I think immigration's the same thing. It's a good thing, but you can have too much of a good thing. And I was listening to the Bill Maher's show last week, and he was trying to pin down his guests to, what would be too many? Like, is there a point at which there are too many people coming in to the United States? And he basically concluded that any answer short of infinity made you a racist and a xenophobe. But the reality is, this society is complicated, and there are limits to what we can absorb in the space of a year or even 10 years. If you look at our schools, if you look at our hospitals, if you look at our services, when you're talking about people who are, generally speaking, low-skilled, I'm talking about illegal immigrants, low-skilled, and don't speak English and may have healthcare needs, they tend to take a lot more services in the beginning than they contribute. So there are, I think, just logistical and societal limits to the number of people that can be absorbed. I think if you go down the ultra libertarian route, the sort of my Cato friends on the other side of this would say, let them all in. Eventually, it sorts out, and they're
Right.
absolutely right. But I don't think it sorts out until we start to look like Caracas or Calcutta, and I'm not sure that most Americans are willing to take that hit to their standard of living.
So I want to challenge that, but I want to understand it because I am not as doctrinaire as my libertarian friends at Cato on this. I don't feel like I understand it well enough. In real terms, like being physically in these places and seeing what happens when millions of people come into the country and gather together, it seems like uh, Europe has handled this in different ways than the U.S. in that immigrants there seem to end up in ghettos. Is there something about the way the U.S. integrates people, even at this scale, that's better than other countries, better than better than France? You go to France and you're Muslim and you basically get shunted to a ghetto and end up being in this, culturally separated environment. That's my impression. Is that true? Like, how do we do at absorbing, even with the challenge of the volume? How do we do at absorbing immigrants relative to other countries?
Well, I could kick back a little bit on the France part because I lived there for about 8 years. But in the United States, we had a couple of real advantages. First of all, we're huge, and we were not settled in the first 150 years to any degree. The native population was through disease and warfare wiped out from a high of maybe 20 million down to a fraction of that. And so a lot of the country was sort of wide open for farming, for settlements. So you had communities of Germans and Swedes and Danes and Eastern European Jews and Italians and whatever that would just go off to various parts of the country, start their own communities, and then eventually sort of integrate. And we did in the beginning have I wouldn't, ghetto is that term from Venice, where they had a special island where all the Jews lived. But we use that term to mean it's kind of pejorative, a group of people of one ethnicity. But let's just call them an ethnic enclave. I had one of the guys working at my school when I was a kid. He grew up in a part of Trenton, New Jersey, that was a little Italy. Everybody was Italian. People spoke Italian. They ate Italian food. They went to Catholic church. Then his son became a screenwriter out in Hollywood. So that's just a little tiny microcosm of what tended to happen. People, with the exception of the Amish and maybe the Hasidic Jews who are still very much together, most people, after a generation or two, they may have started in an all-Irish or all-German or all-Italian neighborhood, but they grew up, they got jobs, they went other places in the country, and they mixed up and they integrated. And I still think that force is powerfully at work. You're seeing that in the so-called Hispanic community, which of course is a very varied community with nothing in common other than the census decided to put them in the same category back in the 70s. But you see people from the second and third generation from Latin America going all over the country and doing whatever it is that they want to do. So I think that's a powerful engine that we have. Europe is constrained by demography, by geography as well as demography. It's pretty much all settled. So if you come in from Algeria or Morocco in the 1960s, 70s, and up to today, it's not like you can just start a village in the middle of nowhere. You've got to go somewhere, and you tend to go where you know people, where they speak your language, and you start there. But there are plenty of French immigrants who've made it out of wherever they started and settled all over the country. But I do think we have an advantage. It's also part of our culture. We believe that we're a country of immigrants. That's what our history tells us. And so there's a positivity to it that may not be there in European countries that have had to struggle for nationhood, maybe had a couple wars over it, and still see themselves as an ethnically distinct people.
Yeah, the concept of American culture as a single thing. How do you think about that? Is that even real? Because we're so diverse. We've always been very diverse. We're geographically large. So what does American culture mean to you?
Yeah, that's the giant philosophical question. I'm sure that many books have been written about. I'll tell you what it means for me. I came here when I was so I moved to France when I was 1, and looked around, realized people didn't speak English, and so I learned French. And by the time I was 5, I spoke fluent French. And then we came to America when I was 6 and looked around and realized, people don't speak the same way I do. If I don't want to get beaten up, I need to learn how to speak like they do. And I looked around. What do people do every morning? They pledge allegiance to the flag. So you do that. We have an anthem. We have a common history. We have a constitution. We have a Bill of Rights. So immigrants absorb those very, very fundamental basic things, which should never be underestimated. I mean, there are lots of countries in this world where you can't say what you want to say. You can't criticize the government. We're having a debate about gender and race and immigration, all these things. People have strong opinions, but by and large, they can express those opinions. And that simply isn't true in much of the world. So I would say our culture is defined by some very basic principles enshrined in our founding documents, and that everything else is variable. You're the way you cook, the music you listen to, the sports you want to watch, all of that is variable from region to region and subculture to subculture. But fundamentally, if we don't all agree that the Bill of Rights is a good thing and that our country was founded on just principles, even if it has lots of chapters in its history that need revision and that we should maybe learn lessons from, then we're really in trouble, because that's all that glues us together.
How would you define your vision for what good immigration policy would look like in the country? And then I want to talk about how you think people mischaracterize that view. And you could just be for yourself, but maybe also for the institution. But let's start with you and you. What does good immigration look like in the U.S.?
Well, the legal system that we have right now is about 850,000 people a year being given green cards and allowed to live in the country. About 2/3 of them are coming in petitioned by relatives, spouses, brothers, sisters, parents, children. And the other third is for work. Employers are petitioning for them to come and take jobs in the United States that they need filled. I think that's a good model, but I think we need to flip it on its head. And for this, I can speak definitely for the institution, probably a lot of conservatives. We need to have maybe 2/3 skills-based immigration, and maybe a lower number on family-based. So just because you have one member of a family from a given country doesn't necessarily mean that you want their parents and their 8 brothers and sisters and then their spouses, 35 people who come in on the backs of the one. Doesn't make sense to me that that's family unification, is to unify the 35 people where the one went as opposed to the other way around. You don't want to close that door entirely, but you just want to rebalance it. And then the skills-based immigration should be of 2 kinds. One, the permanent kind. Advocates of immigration always say, but all the founders of these Silicon Valley companies are from Russia and India. That's absolutely true. We want to encourage the best and the brightest to come here, and those that are really the cream of the crop to stay. But not everybody who gets a 2-year degree is so the best and the brightest. The number of people going to college now is extremely high. It may even be above 50%. So there's a weeding out process that could be done in our favor, where we could pick the ones that have the better skills, no criminal record, speak English, are younger, harder working. The Australians have a system like that. The Canadians do. And I believe the Germans actually just created a new visa, which is a points-based visa. If you speak German, if you were educated there, if you have skills that they need, then you're going to go to the top of the line. So that's the framework of the system that I think works. We can maybe raise that number from 850 to something higher. We could lower it. There are definitely people who want to do both. And then we should have a system of non-immigrant visas, sometimes called guest worker visas, that really are temporary. If we're going to bring people in, for example, under the H-1B program, which is this usually high-tech workers, most of them from India, that are supposedly taking jobs that Americans won't do. This has been going on for like 35 years now. You would think that our colleges and universities would have pivoted by now to try to educate, fewer people in studies and more people in high tech and IT and things that the market wants. But as long as there's a plentiful supply for lower wages, then they're just going to keep using that visa. And it has turned into an immigrant visa over time. The expectation is that you come on this temporary visa for 3 years, supposedly, and then but in reality, people extend it, and then they end up in the line for a green card forever. This is the same with what they call H-2A, H-2B. These are visas for people working in agriculture, H-2A, or people working, for example, in the hotel industry. In the case of H-2Bs, they can work really well as temporary worker visas. Jamaicans, for example, are famously come work in the hospitality industry for the season, and then they go back home again, and everybody wins. So I think a combination of a very flexible temporary worker visa system and an immigrant system that privileges or prefers skills-based arrivals over just family unification, that's what the system should be based on. And then we can just negotiate the numbers.
The question of which skills are worth letting people in to become either workers or permanent residents is something I struggle to understand, because help me understand how that would work, because I can't imagine there's a merit-based definition that would have fit for my, 13-year-old Sicilian grandfather, who on paper doesn't look like a great bet in 1920. So today, if that person is, 18-year-old from Mexico who's coming here wanting to build a life, wanting to make more money, live in a safe neighborhood, do all the things that the American dream has to offer, who's going to be the one to decide whether they make the cut, and how why should I think that that's possible to do at scale?
Well, let me go back just a little bit, because you were asking me what was different about, the 1920 and today, or 1880, when your grandfather came over. And one thing that people forget is that there's something incompatible about open borders and a welfare state. We did not have a welfare state when your grandfather came. When he came, or just hypothetically, a 13-year-old kid from Italy coming in 1920 would have plugged into a network of Italian Americans, family, friends. Someone would have given him a place to sleep, and someone would have given him a job. He did not get a free house from New York City. He didn't get a free e-scooter. He didn't get 3 free catered meals a day. He didn't get health care. He didn't get any of the benefits that are paid for by the taxpayers at the time. So it was kind of a sink or swim immigration world back then. And so people would not just come speculatively on the off chance that they were going to make it. They came when they knew that they had a network to plug into. Now, we see these cases of people, hundreds and thousands into the millions. They come to the border, they're released, and then they're immediately able to tap into federal, state, and local benefits in a way that their ancestors never were. So that's just one thing I wanted to put out there, because it is a real structural difference between then and now. And I think under the libertarian model, they would say, no, you shouldn't get anything when you come. It's sink or swim, because that's kind of their model. But we don't have that. We've got a social welfare state at the moment, and I don't see that being dismantled anytime soon, certainly not for the sanctuary cities. And then as to how the point system would work, if it was up to me, I wouldn't make it a super specific, like you have to have this skill and that. It would more be, you get a point if you have English at such and such a level. You get a point if you finished high school. You get another point if you finished college. You get another point if your college degree is one of the degrees that we're looking for people to work in that industry. So and again, we're talking about the legal immigration system.
Yeah.
It would be a fairly low bar for people to pass. But if, for example, you were 78 years old and need dialysis once a week, and you live in Pakistan, that person might not get a whole lot of points, because they're almost certainly not going to contribute into the system, and they're almost certainly going to withdraw from that system the moment they arrive, and that gets expensive.
Brian Kaplan and others that advocate for the economic benefit of a much more open, functionally open borders policy, where you can just come in, it'd be legal because it's like, come on in. They argue that actually, as a practical matter, as an empirical matter, that the people that come into the country are overwhelmingly in the sweet spot, which is to say working age, not too young, not too old, and that on net, they end up being lower consumers of the welfare state than actual native-born citizens. How do you respond to that?
Well, I can see the argument, but we do know that about half of the people who've come in under Biden, either paroled or released, are not working because they are women or children or infirm. So that may be true for half the population, but if you've got the other half claiming benefits, going to school, taking medical care, then I'm not sure that that equation pans out. And it's just a feature of our country these days that we have an incredibly generous welfare state. In some cities and states, like Denver and New York, you have a right to shelter. So you can come from Venezuela on a Monday and by Wednesday be living in state-funded accommodation for $300 a night. One of the things I've always noticed, I've had some libertarian friends growing up, and they're always the smartest people I know. I had a friend who was a lawyer, and then he went to medical school, and another friend who was a psychiatrist. And I always thought, if everybody was like them, then libertarian philosophy would totally work out, right? We could all have guns all the time. We would have no speed limits. We would have just no rules, and society would probably work. But sadly, if you travel around a bit, as I have, and you work I've had 25 jobs in my life, from, cab driving to waiting tables to construction, you realize that not everybody is that smart, and many people make very, very bad decisions. So I think that sort of philosophically, open borders makes sense, but in practicality, it really doesn't work on the ground.
One of the things related to this is the idea that there's a lot of unfilled jobs in this country even now. Things you see, for example, with truck drivers, that there's just enormous numbers of really high-paying jobs like truck driving, especially in all of the things that our university system is built to discourage you from doing, where you'll come out and actually make a decent wage and be able to build a life for yourself instead of working at Starbucks hoping to write the great American novel. Isn't it the case that let's say half the people that are coming in are kind of essential, that we won't be able to have the farming capacity that we have, the truck driving, the manual labor, like that we're just fundamentally reliant on immigration to have our economy work?
You're mixing two different things, though. We're talking about legal immigration, and everything you said, I think, could be defended, and illegal. It's just two different things. If the argument is we need mass, uncontrolled, unvetted, illegal immigration for our economy to work, then we got bigger problems. There's something fundamentally wrong with our economy. We've got cities where like 10 or 11% of kids can actually read and function in English. These are native-born kids. Or only 15% know any American history, or only 10%, I'm talking about actual U.S. cities, can do math at grade. So our educational system is failing to prepare an awful lot of our native-born for some of these jobs. We're also siphoning off. And when I was a kid, I went to college. I think it was about 5% of people went to college in the country I went to college in. And now it's something like 50%. So we're putting people into higher education who probably don't need to be there. Like, it's not teaching them anything that's going to get them a useful job. And we're not encouraging them to go into skilled trades where they could do something useful that would make them feel good, that would pay them a living wage. So there's some structural adjustments I think we have to make in our economy. And I don't think it's a good solution to keep importing cheap labor to try to fill that need and then ignoring our own societal problems at the same time.
Let's focus on the question of whether or not we should have a lot more legal immigrants then. Would you say it's fair to say that let me take a step back. Is there anyone truly arguing for the status quo, which is to say mass illegal immigration? Is the real debate just about how much and how easy should it be to come in?
I would say that the Biden administration is essentially arguing in favor of open borders. Now, it does not mean literal open borders. Mayorkas once said that they were releasing 85% of people who showed up at the border or more. So would you describe a door that you pushed at 10 times and it only opened 8.7 of those times as open? I suppose literally no, but it sure ain't closed, right? And they do say frequently that they believe in safe, orderly, humane migration. They believe in lawful pathways. And what that boils down to, if you drill a little deeper, is they actually believe that every human being on Earth has the right to show up at the United States, claim asylum, and be released into the country pending the decision, which they hope would be, yes, you can stay. And then they claim that they will deport people who are found to be removable after due process. But if you look at the numbers, they're not actually deporting anybody. They will probably deport the Venezuelan gangster who killed Lake and Riley. They'll probably deport that guy from El Salvador who killed Rachel Morin. The ones that get into the news that are really embarrassing, they'll probably carry out the full whatever the judge orders. But in the vast majority of cases, this administration, Mayorkas, has actually written a memo saying we're not going to enforce the law against people who are here just illegally. So there's a sort of structural open borders baked into the equation, and I would say they are arguing for it, and they're increasingly bolder about saying that out loud. So the debate for me isn't between open borders and closed borders. I don't know many people who argue that we should not have any immigration at all. The debate, as far as I can see, is between people who believe in a universal human right to migrate wherever you want to go, and those of us that believe that nations have the right to control immigration, and they have sovereignty to make that decision, and that decision should be made by the rule of law and not by the bum rush.
My understanding is, if you look back, there's a famous sort of moment debate between President Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, in which they were both, I think this was in a trying to remember when this was actually, but there was, I remember there's a clip of President Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush on a debate stage, essentially tripping over themselves to try to look more favorable towards immigrants and more sort of open-hearted about it. And I know, President Reagan went on to pass, I think, the largest amnesty in modern American history. What was happening then that where that was deemed an appropriate policy by President Reagan that isn't happening now? Help me understand the Reagan amnesty and put it in context today.
Okay, so where the Reagan amnesty was 86, and maybe the discussion between Bush and Reagan would have been the 80 election, the primaries for the 80 election.
I think that's what it was. But
so that's around the time we're talking about the Mariel boat lift, and a lot of Cubans coming in, and you got to throw the Florida electoral politics into the mix. And the vast majority of people coming illegally into the U.S. in those days were Mexicans. So between 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, and 1965, Hart-Celler, there was very, very low immigration into the U.S. because it was controlled based on a percentage of people already in the U.S. from whatever country. And after 65, they opened it up to the entire world, and everybody was rather surprised to see that immigration went from 85% European to 90% African, Asian, and Latin American. So there was that huge change in 65. By the time the 86 amnesty came around, they were still separating people at the border into Mexican and OTM, other than Mexican. That's how few there were. The vast majority of people coming in illegally were Mexicans looking for jobs. So it was really a Mexican political issue, Mexican-American issue. And the 1986 amnesty, which was the Immigration Reform and Control Act, was a bipartisan deal based on the premise that, okay, there's these people in, it's about 3 million. We're not going to get rid of them, or we're not going to make the effort to. We're going to give them this amnesty, but in exchange, we want to make sure this doesn't happen again, because we are a country of rules and laws, and we want to make sure that we don't allow people to just kind of bum rush their way in and then have to do another amnesty in 5, 10, 15 years. So they married it with workplace enforcement. And what was supposed to happen is that employers were supposed to verify that people coming in had a legal right to work, or else they couldn't hire them. And that would essentially turn off the draw of people coming in mass, because then the employers would get punished if they hired people who were there illegally. And what happened was, the first part, the amnesty, that happened. The second part, the workplace enforcement, for various reasons that we could go into, never happened. So the right really felt like they got burned on that deal. And that's why amnesty is such a toxic word today, is because they understand that whatever they bargain in exchange, that deal is probably never going to be kept. And then about 10 years later, in 1994 to 6, there was a bipartisan commission of Congress led by a Democrat from Texas named Barbara Jordan that came out with a huge report. It took them 2 years to write, recommending what we should do for the future for immigration. And one of the keys was we need to let people in who our law says can come in, and we need to keep people out or get them out who came in illegally. Remember, this is led by a Democrat. It was bipartisan. That would be the Clinton administration, right? 94 to 96. If you read that report today, I agree with everything in it, pretty much. I mean, by and large, it is the position of call him a moderate Republican, moderate conservative today. But the Democratic Party has moved so far left since then that they wouldn't even touch this report that was produced by their party leading. So the terms of the debate have just changed radically since Reagan and Bush were talking about it. They were dealing with a much, much smaller scale problem. There are estimates that we have somewhere between 12 and 20 million people living here illegally. There's 10 million people have been encountered just under the Biden administration. And let's say only half of them have been let in. Then you've got another 1.5 million paroled and another 2 million gotaways. You know, we're nudging up towards 10 million people in this country just since President Biden took over. So the scale of it, that's 3 times the people who were amnestied in 1986. That's one of the things that's changed since then. And as I said, because of the consequences of the amnesty, because it never panned out as promised, it soured a lot of people on that kind of compromise in future. And that's the impasse we find ourselves in today.
Expand on the views of Barbara Jordan. Like, lay that out for me, because obviously we've been working on this rap video, and we're talking about including her as a character. So, who was Barbara Jordan, and what were her views that you agreed with, or that you agree with now?
Well, I wouldn't. It's not her views. It was the report of the bipartisan commission that actually came out after she died. I think she died in 95, and the report came out in 96. I don't know a lot about her. I know she was a Democrat from Texas. She was a classic liberal in the sense of the 1990s anyway. And the report reflects the Democratic Party of the Bill Clinton era, which was, as I probably said in the beginning, a party that believed in upholding the rule of law when it came to immigration. And yeah, I'm sure they supported many of them supported the amnesty in 96, and probably many of them would have wanted increased numbers for legal immigration. But there was never any question that they felt that they should enforce the law. And the report, as I remember it, one thing it says is that immigration should be legal, and the consequences of the illegality should be enforced. So after that came out, there was a law passed in 1996 called the Illegal Immigration Responsibility and Immigration Reform Act, something like that, IRIRA. And that law created penalties for living here illegally. If you're here 6 months to a year, you have a 3-year bar from coming back if you're removed. If you're here longer than a year, you have a 10-year bar. Trying to say to people, look, there are consequences for coming here illegally. The Jordan Commission felt that was important, that if you had impunity, like we have today, then you will attract enormous numbers of people seeking to take advantage of our generosity. They also, they expressly, if I remember correctly, said that parole, which is a power in the Immigration and Nationality Act, Section 212, should be used sparingly, and it should not be a substitute for the refugee system. And essentially what President Biden is doing is using it as a substitute for the the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, the USRAP. So that was expressly in the report, and it made it into the law in IRIRA. They also created a system for expedited removal, where you're saying, look, if you let someone into the country and then kind of release them, as we're doing now, and kick the whole process down the road, it's going to cost a huge amount of money, take forever. And then when you do actually have to remove the person because they have no right to be here, maybe they have kids, maybe they have a family, maybe they have a job, and it's just going to be that much more complicated and uncomfortable for all concerned. So let's have a system that hears them out. Okay, you're coming from, Guatemala. You're 22. You're a Mason by trade, and why are you here? Well, I'm afraid if I go back, they'll persecute me. But give them a quicker determination of that case so that you weed out the ones who are clearly coming to work. And for a long time, many people would say that, and they still will. If you interview people on the trail into the U.S., down to the Darien Gap and all the way up to the border, I've been down 5 times to the border now, and you talk to people, they'll tell you, if you ask them why you're here, they say, I want to find a job. I'm going to go here. And then if you push them a bit about persecution, they'll, yeah, I'm being persecuted, because they have a WhatsApp channel and they know what they're supposed to say. But this expedited removal system was supposed to cut to the chase and separate the wheat from the chaff, the genuine asylum cases from the pure economic migrants who should be taken care of under either the legal system or the refugee system, or if they're not allowed to come in, shouldn't be allowed in. And that was put into the law. But essentially, it's been sidelined. If you look at how many illegal immigrants crossing into the country, illegal arrivals, how many are being given expedited removal, it's a tiny minority. It doesn't apply to families. It doesn't apply to minors. It doesn't apply to people who claim a credible fear, et cetera, et cetera. So it really, the law in '96 was based on that report. Didn't have everything that was in the report, but the intent was to put some teeth into enforcement and to restore the rule of law and to make immigration about what was in U.S. national interest and not in the interests of the rest of the world. Unfortunately, I think we've abandoned the bipartisanship of that report, and the parties have split and kind of gone pretty far in their own directions.
If we want to set aside, I think like any reasonable person, I would like to believe, could look at the situation as it exists now and say, illegal activity. If we want something to be happening that's currently happening illegally, but we think it should be happening legally, then we should change the law. I don't think any reasonable person would be advocating for illegal activity rather than advocating to change the law on things that maybe they see as unjustly prohibited. So if we set aside the illegality that's currently happening because of how many people are coming not through proper channels, and just focus on, okay, how easy is it if you want to come here and work, to come here and work and contribute and possibly become a citizen or become a permanent resident. Help me understand the tension in what you're describing between going to the border and saying everyone there wants to work, and but they want to come here and take our welfare. Like, those two things seem like they're at odds with each other.
Well, there's both. I mean, we've seen in the last, especially the last week, a string of murders and robberies committed by people who came in and were released at the border. I mean, New York City has a population of, 60,000 illegal immigrants either paroled or released, and the crime is through the roof. They're driving around on these unregistered scooters. Here in D.C., we have all these illegal immigrants driving around on scooters that say 49 cc's on the back, because then they don't have to be licensed. But they're more than 50 cc's. They should be licensed. The mayor's office got embarrassed and is trying to crack down on it. But you've got muggings and knife fights and, at the worst case, murders. There is a lot of crime, and there are a proportion of the people coming in who are not coming here to seek work. They're coming here to seek work in the crime business. It's not a majority, of course. It's a percentage, but even 2.5%, which is one estimate that I heard when I was in Texas, 2.5% of people say are coming here to carry out something nefarious. If you're talking about millions of people, that's an awful lot of people, and we have zero ability to look into the criminal records of anyone showing up at the border. That's one of the biggest lies that I'm really sad to see repeated over and over again by this administration. They say people are carefully vetted before we release them. They're not. If they come in from, let's say, Venezuela or Russia, we can look at their records in the United States because we have good databases and we can match their fingerprints and their name if they give us a real one. But they come in often with no ID because they threw it away. They give us a fake name, fake birthday. And if we have no record of them in the United States, DHS is releasing them. So this the guy from El Salvador who murdered Rachel Morin, he apparently had killed someone else. I say allegedly because I guess he hasn't been convicted. He had apparently a record for murder back in his home country. And a lot of the Tren de Aragua, that's a Venezuelan gang, and MS-13, which is a Salvadoran, I think, originally gang, a lot of these young men coming in actually have long rap sheets back home that we have no way of checking. So that's one of the serious risks. I'm not even talking about terrorism. That would take a whole other 90 minutes of the 250-odd people that have come in the last few years who are known or suspected terrorists. Even if only one or two of them carries out an attack, we've seen what can happen at the World Trade Center and other places in the United States in the past. So I do want to make it clear that these risks are unknown. And then to get to, I think, the first part of your question about the mismatch between supply and demand, that's what it boils down to. You will never have a system that is able to bring every single adult who wants to work in the United States in. It's just, if you do any kind of surveys, there was one in Korea years ago where it was like, 40% of Korean adults surveyed said that they would come to the United States if they could, if the visa was no cost and they get one tomorrow. Now, South Korea has gotten a lot wealthier since then, so I imagine that number's probably gone down and their birth rate has plummeted. But if you did that in India or Pakistan or Cameroon or Nigeria or Ghana, you would find that an awful lot of people would want to come to the USA if they could. And while they may all be great people who would make fantastic Americans, I don't think we have the ability to absorb, 1 billion people. And I don't overestimate that. I was speaking to a guy the other day from Senegal, just informally. He said, yeah, I talked to my friends and they said if we could, if it was free, we'd all go tomorrow. And I've worked in India and Ghana and other countries where there is a significant proportion of the population that if they could, would come. So I just think it is an impossible dream to create a system that will accommodate every, even law-abiding, even hardworking adult who wants to come to this country. There just isn't the capacity.
I want to push on that a bit. I think that's completely intuitive. I think just about, you put that forward to most Americans and they would say, well, of course we can't have 1 billion people come to America. Like, you'd hear things like, we'd run out of room, we'd run out of space. I've driven around most of the states. We have a lot of room. We have a lot of open space. And also we're now, I think, more than 50% of our population is in fairly dense urban areas. So if anything, we're actually, as we get wealthier, and get more and more urbanized around the whole planet, the amount of open space actually is increasing. So this is a radical question, but what's so bad if we had 500 million people come to this country who want to work and contribute? If we could do it legally, if we could have a process, I know this is probably the most utopian thing, that we could have a government process capable of even doing that efficiently. But let's imagine in our minds that the federal government could do that, could actually move people through, and they would be legal. They'd be coming here legally through a process that was the most efficient thing government's ever done in all of American history. Why would that be bad? Why aren't more people good for America?
Well, I go back to my, glass of wine at dinner argument. A glass of wine may be good for you, but 3 bottles is not. Immigrants are good for America, but unlimited immigration, I would argue, is not. And I don't think a lot of Americans travel. I mean, it's always been the case. Less than half of us have passports. And so they may not have an idea what Lagos looks like, or what Calcutta looks like, or New Delhi, or Shanghai, or Jakarta. And I think they really ought to go and see what it looks like when you have a mass urban conglomeration with poor services. Now, we're obviously a richer country, but it's not very libertarian to say to people, you got to go here, right? The government's going to control it. But yes, thought experiment. Let's say that the government could. It would take that. It would take that kind of draconian control, because people go where they want to go, right? They go where the jobs are. Why are they in New York City and not in Newark? Because they've heard of New York City. They think there's opportunities there. They get a free house. The city is giving them all these free services. If you drive up 95, as I've done for almost 40 years now, from Florida all the way up to Maine or anywhere in between, it's getting more and more crowded. New Jersey, when I grew up there, our town was surrounded by farms. There was one mall. Now there are no farms. It's all housing estates, and there's like 10 malls. Because we're developing the same parts of the country. And the fact is, when people come in, they're not going to rural Pennsylvania or Ohio or Indiana where there's a depleting population because people are aging and they're not being replaced. They're going to New York. They're going to Northern Virginia. They're going to L.A. They're going to the same places. So while, technically, if you spread everybody out, we have a very big country and it would be livable with 500 million people and maybe even 1 billion people. I don't know. I wouldn't want to live there. But let's just say if you spread everybody out, you probably could handle 1 billion people. But that's not what's going to happen. They're going to keep coming to the same places, and the rents are going to go through the roof, and the housing costs are going to go up, and the roads are going to get clogged, and the schools are going to get clogged, and the hospitals are going to get clogged because fundamentally people do what's in their best interests and not what's in the country's best interests. I think we've all heard of the program where they would hire rural doctors, from whatever country, and they'd say, you got to go work in the boondocks for a couple of years in exchange for your visa. How many of them actually stay in the boondocks? Some do, but most of them eventually will head back to the cities or the communities where they have friends and family, and then they want to plug in. So I think if you had absolute state control like they have in China, where people have a pass that says you're only allowed to live and get benefits in this area, maybe it would work. But other than that, if you give people free will, which is as American as apple pie, then I think they're going to go where they want to go, and you're going to find the growth is always going to be in the same place as it is now.
My understanding is that during the COVID, the intense period of COVID 2020, 2021, that actually net immigration from Mexico went negative. Before I follow up the follow-up question, is that your understanding too? Am I getting that right?
Well, between what are we talking, like 2020 to 20? What's the time period?
It's in that 20. It's in that 2-year period. At the point where there was a point, my understanding is there was a point in that time frame where it was really hard to work here, and so actually, like, net migration from Mexico went negative. People were going back to Mexico, or not more people were going back to Mexico than coming into the U.S.
It's certainly possible. I mean, I remember that time and everything was shut down. The border was shut. You couldn't, get a visa. And illegal immigrants were probably being sent back to Mexico. Not just the ones showing up at the border, but people who were here already. Remember that 7.4 million cases I told you about, the non-detained docket?
Yeah.
There's about, I think it's over 1.2 million people who have actual deportation orders from a judge who are still here. And of those, about 400,000 are convicted criminals. So during those 2 years, Immigration and Customs Enforcement was probably still trying to remove at least the convicted criminals, if not the 1.2 million. So that would explain some of the negative numbers. And if hardly anybody was getting in other than the gotaways, because that's always an estimate, yeah, it's possible.
Yeah, I think the thing that's what, like, Kaplan and Narasta and others who advocate for pretty much a wide open legal door, like, come on in, so long as you don't have tuberculosis or whatever. I think the fundamental underlying argument they make is that this is basically as close to the classic sort of dollar on the floor waiting to be picked up as we have. That, people that come here from a country that doesn't have strong institutions like we have, as in rule of law, functional companies that aren't just completely criminal enterprises, etc. They come in and they're immediately radically more productive, and that they end up being net contributors. That they even with the welfare state as it exists, that in fact, I think the strongest version of the argument that gets made is that the people most likely to come, and as an empirical matter, that are workers, are maybe the only way we can even hope to maintain some of the welfare systems that Americans currently take for granted, like Social Security and Medicare, both of which are essentially Ponzi schemes entirely reliant on a large workforce relative to a much smaller number of beneficiaries. And now we've got the workforce shrinking and the population aging. So don't we actually need a lot more people, a lot more workers? Aren't we facing a kind of demographic disaster if we don't end up right-sizing that ratio?
Well, I was going to bring up Ponzi if you didn't. The thing about a Ponzi scheme is you got to keep taking in money forever, right? To infinity. So if your argument is that in order to make up for the deficit, we have to keep bringing in people who are then going to get old and add to the deficit, then where does it end? Do we end at 500 million? Do we end at $1 billion? Do we end at 1.5 billion? The countries kind of reach a crossroads. Human beings are free agents, and so we're not like other mammals who breed based on the environment. We do what we want to do. European countries now have below replacement fertility rates, and so does Japan. I think for the first time, we're down below replacement rate of at least native-born Americans. So then you have to make a decision. Well, in Japan's case, they've decided that they don't want to be a country of mass immigration. They have some, but very limited. So they are going to accept that they will shrink in population. And that comes with costs, right? You'll have to devote more resources to elder care than you will to education. But Japan is a rich society. They're a very homogenous society. They're very proud of that social cohesion. And frankly, they're pretty populated. I mean, I've seen pictures of people getting shoved onto subway cars in Tokyo with an actual giant, padded fork. I've never been to another country where that's happened. So maybe they'd be better off with a bit of population shrinkage, and eventually the incentives for young people to have families would be back because they'd be able to afford a bigger house. They'd get a better lifestyle. So I think it would balance itself out somewhere below whatever they are now, 150 million. Other countries have decided to go the mass migration route. I think Western Europe and the United States have gone that route. And it comes with costs because you can't guarantee that all of the people that you're bringing in are going to assimilate and buy into your values. They may decide that they'd rather convince you to go to their way of thinking and their values. So this is a kind of existential question for countries to consider. But I think if the argument is that you need a constant supply of new money to pay off the people who've already invested, then you're never going to win that. You're going to run out of people at some point.
My grandfather, or I should say my great-grandfather, so I heard this sort of secondhand, when Social Security was passed and he was already older, he got a check. And he said, "This country's finished. I didn't contribute to this. I'm getting a check. It's a Ponzi scheme." And as an Italian, to be fearing it's a Ponzi scheme was especially ironic. Is the American public, in your opinion, prepared to deal with that reality? Because we are told things that aren't true and that have never been true about the way these systems work. We're told that Social Security, it has accounts in our name, but that's a lie. There is no money in Social Security. Current workers, my paycheck, my FICA, goes to people like my dad who are retired right now, because in the federal government and out to my dad. So are we prepared for that reckoning? Or do you think,
no.
What's your opinion on that?
No, we're not. I'm a conservative because I believe in conserving things that are good. And I believe in changing things, but only after you've carefully evaluated the consequences of the change you're going to make. So I do believe in balanced budgets. I believe in fiscal responsibility. And I have not seen a lot of fiscal responsibility out of either party. I would say that the Biden administration is burning money like nothing I've ever seen before during a time when the president claims that the economy is awesome. And typically that's when you're supposed to start socking money away so that you can have it saved up for when COVID hits or you have the next recession. But unfortunately, I don't see a whole lot of fiscal responsibility on the right of the aisle. There's more, and there are some particular politicians who are kind of famously budget hawks. And as for the people, I go back to my figures about the percentages of Americans who are math literate. It isn't high, unfortunately. Our public schools have been not doing a great job in the last generation or two. I think people who are educated understand what you've just described, which is that this system without serious adjustment is going to fail. And when I talk to younger people that I work with in their 20s, none of them believe that they're going to collect Social Security when they get old. They laugh when you bring it up. They're like, no, this is not going to be around for us, which is a terrible burden to lay on them, that they're going to have to pay into it with no expectation of getting any of it back. So there's a cynicism, which I think is destructive among people who understand what's going on. And then those people who don't understand, they're just going to cash their check and say, awesome, I'm getting free money. And then when inflation erodes the value of that money, they might complain, but they won't understand the mechanism behind it, which is we're pumping more money, out of the fire hose. And then so the prices of everything, go up and the cycle repeats itself. But, imagine I call this, we're in the Evita stage of the Republic, where she's on the balcony chucking out the candy left and right, Don't cry for me, Argentina. Who's going to be the one who comes along after her and says, no more candy? I'm the party of no more candy. You're not going to get elected, right? So it's very difficult politically to be the person who says we have to do something about entitlements. But people my age and your age probably won't have their full benefits that they were promised. And as I said, people in their 20s, they know it's not going to come.
To come back to culture, this notion of, you'd mentioned that with mass migration, even legal, there is this risk of people coming in who fundamentally disagree with the underlying principles of the country. One challenge back to this, I would say, and I'd be curious to get your reaction to, is that, and this is an unpopular thing for me to say, I look at college campuses in the United States and the things you see on social media coming out of Gen Zers, and I find that the ideology at play there far less American in the constitutional sense than the Mexican Americans, legal and illegal, who I've met here in Texas, who come here to work, believe in hard work, are often Christian, conservative-minded people that believe in family values, that teach their kids to work hard, to get a good grade in school. I think from a culture trade, if I believe in conserving those sort of classic American values, I would say I'd rather have more Mexicans than those Columbia grads. Am I being just unfair to our blue-haired neighbors and kids, or how do you think about that?
Look, I mean, I'll happily say this because we're in fantasy land, but if I could trade a couple hundred blue hair nose rings from GW or Colombia for 100 hardworking immigrants from Africa, West Africa, or Latin America, I would do that in a heartbeat. But, they have a right to be here. They're American citizens. We're stuck with them. No, I've been appalled, too, because, I've had all kinds of stupid opinions in my life. Some would argue my opinions today are stupid, but my opinions today are based on a lifetime of discussion and experience and negotiation. And I would not have been able to arrive at them without being able to talk to people who disagree violently with, I don't mean violently, but disagree with me strongly on whatever point it is. I mean, you mentioned Brian Kaplan. I listened to a podcast once in my car, and I forget which one it was, but it was Brian talking about his book. So I Googled him, and I wrote and said, hey, could we meet up? Because you're like the literal opposite of everything that I believe, and you seem like a nice guy, and I just want to hear what you have to say. So we went and had a kebab, and it was great. And, he's a nice guy. Yeah. Now, if two people like me and Brian can't get together from opposite ends of a debate on immigration and talk, how are we ever going to arrive at any kind of policy that the voters can vote for? And I'm appalled at the students who are out there shouting down professors who want to come onto their campus and talk about topics that they really should be interested in and that they should be able to handle. Their law professors have been kicked out of Berkeley. Columbia is a notorious hotbed of Hamasniks right now, and these kids don't seem to be able to tolerate even civilized human beings, giving them views that they oppose. And that's really not good for our democracy.
Yeah. So, but to push on that, I mean, is it really the case that that the risk is higher to the values I think you and I share about what I think has made this country successful, which is an appetite for risk taking, an ability to, a certain kind of, you could say, Protestant work ethic, even though I'm Catholic. It does seem like even in our modern age, with the ease of transport and technology, it's still fundamentally very difficult to move into a new country. That's still, no matter what, you're coming to a place where you don't know people, you don't necessarily speak the language. Doesn't that create a selection bias that is still good on average for America? These are going to be positive risk taking, as in taking risks to improve your life, entrepreneurial. I've seen Wall Street Journal had a recent article saying that, Latino Americans, for immigrant Latino Americans, have a higher rate of entrepreneurship. They actually have the highest rate of entrepreneurship of any group if you're going to slice and dice it demographically. So isn't that good for America? Isn't the culture balance, as a matter of fact, on balance, good for us?
Well, there's a lot of questions in that question. When you talk about Hispanics, what are you talking about? Are you talking about Cuban entrepreneurs, Cuban Jews like Alejandro Mayorkas? Are you talking about people from the Mariel boat lift? Are you talking about Afro-Cubans? When you talk about Latin Americans, it's everything from people in Guatemala who are of pure indigenous descent to people in Argentina who are of pure, say, Italian descent, and have varied economic, cultural, social experiences. So, it's such a diverse community that it's very difficult to generalize about Hispanics. I think, yes, there's some bias in the population of people that shows up at the border towards risk-taking. But the numbers are so vast now, and it's so easy. I was listening to a Chinese guy being interviewed at the border by a journalist, and he was saying that he knew it was going to be easy to get in to the U.S. when he saw this Chinese version of WhatsApp story of a guy with one leg who'd made it through the Darien Gap. We think, well, I know some incredible people with physical handicaps, but the Darien Gap has been described as this death trap for many years. But it's now got enough beaten trails, and there are networks of cartels and alien smugglers that are so sophisticated and efficient that you don't have to be all that much of a risk taker. I met some guys in California and San Diego from India. And now I've lived in India for 2 years. I used to speak the language. I've interviewed tens of thousands of young Punjabis, Sikhs, for visas in particular. So I know that demo pretty well. I probably interviewed their fathers. And these guys, they had bought a package deal from somebody in, Jalandhar or whatever to get them to, I think, Nicaragua. And then they had a bus take them all the way up to the border, stops in hotels and meals. And then they were released at the border into the caring hands of the Border Patrol. So for those guys, there was zero risk. I mean, they were still wearing nice clothes that they had probably gotten off the plane with a few days earlier. Some people absolutely have had much harder treks if they didn't have the money to pay up front. But the concierge level illegal immigration today is simply unbelievable. And it would have been unimaginable to people like your grandfather who came, a third class on a ship from Europe, and it took them 10 days to get here.
What exactly is a sanctuary city?
It's a term used to describe cities and states that don't cooperate with federal law enforcement. So, for example, if the police arrest somebody for drunk driving and they suspect that person is in the country illegally, if they were to inform Immigration and Customs Enforcement, then ICE could run the guy's name and say, oh, yeah, he's actually wanted for DUI, in this state, or for robbery in this state, or they could cooperate with that local law enforcement to put that person through the immigration process. And for one example of this is, let's say you have someone who commits robbery in Maryland or assault. and they are arrested by the Maryland police. They're convicted in a Maryland court, and they're sentenced to 2 years. And at the end of those 2 years, they are removable. They're deportable under immigration law if, let's say, they're living here illegally, or even if they are legal, but they've now committed this felony that makes them removable.
Why would a city or city government adopt a policy that's at odds with federal immigration law? Like, what do they have to gain from that?
Votes, politics. I mean, look at, I don't know if you've seen the clips going around of Jamal Bowman and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez in New York City competing for I think Bowman's running in a primary against another Democrat, but who's slightly less far left. They're pandering to a constituency. They're trying to get votes in a particular area. So their line, ceasefire now, I guess they believe is going to resonate with those voters in a way that it wouldn't somewhere else. It's the same thing with immigration. There are city politicians and state politicians who believe that they will get elected, and let's give them credit. Maybe ideologically, they do not believe in immigration enforcement. And so they create policies to make it easy for people who are here illegally to remain illegally and to live as American citizens, even if they are not. The most notorious examples are probably California, New York City, Illinois, the places where you would suspect where there are left-of-center governments, large populations of legal immigrants, but also large populations of illegal immigrants. Because otherwise, it makes no sense, right? You should want to cooperate with law enforcement to keep bad guys off the streets. That's basically what it's about. It's about community safety. That's why we have laws. When California decriminalized shoplifting for under $1,000, what did you see? More shoplifting. They did the same thing in D.C., and we saw a CVS store not more than maybe a mile from here just totally cleaned out, because if people know that they can steal at will without any kind of punishment, they'll do it. If people know they can carjack and that they have a almost negligible chance of going to jail, unfortunately, some people who are inclined to criminal behavior are more likely to carry it out. So it's, in my mind, sanctuary cities are sort of in line with the rogue prosecutor or the defund the police, the abolitionist movement that does not believe in law enforcement. They think that there should be, community justice solutions and social interventions, and there's a whole series of things that they think would help. But what they don't believe in is punishing people for committing crimes, and that includes immigration. So sanctuary cities essentially don't cooperate with federal law enforcement, which unfortunately sometimes results in dangerous criminals not being deported back to their home countries to be a risk to those people, and instead remaining in our communities to be a risk to ours.
The pro, more open borders crowd, including Brian Kaplan, Alex Nowrasteh, and some others, make a claim that I'm curious if you feel is false, which is that crime is and criminal activity happens at a lower rate among immigrants, including illegal immigrants, than the actual native-born American population. That essentially immigrants aren't as there's more American-born criminals as a percentage of all American-born citizens than immigrant criminals, illegal or otherwise. Do you think that is actually true? Do you have a rebuttal to that on the crime stats of it all? What's your perspective on this claim?
Yeah, I don't believe it's true. It's attributed to a British politician named Benjamin Disraeli that there are lies, damned lies, and statistics. You can make statistics do what you want them to do. Now, Brian, I know, is an economist, and he's a smart guy, and I'm sure he has some sources for the claim. The problem is with illegal immigration and crime is that there is no reliable data. I think the state of Texas is the only state that records the immigration status of criminals. And there, I do not believe that there is a higher incidence of crime from native-born people than from immigrants. You also have to consider the difference between legal immigrants, like myself, and illegal immigrants. That's a huge difference because any crime committed by an illegal immigrant, from robbery to carjacking to murder, is a preventable crime. It's 100% preventable. Whereas crimes committed by Americans who were born here or are legal immigrants, unfortunately, are a risk that we have to run, right? That's our family. These are our people. But if you lately there's been headlines saying that crime has gone down in the country, and you only have to scratch gently beneath the surface to realize that that's a bogus claim, because something like 30% of U.S. jurisdictions, including a lot of our biggest cities, don't actually report crime to the FBI's database on which they're basing that assertion. So you have to look at other sources to see whether it's a factually true claim or not. And they also, most states do not report the immigration status of people who are arrested or of even convicted criminals. So the data on which they're making that assessment is very uncertain. But I would stipulate, just for the sake of argument, that the rate of criminality among immigrants, legal and illegal, is the same as it is among native-born people. Let's just say that for the sake of argument. The murder rate in the U.S. on average is about 5 in 100,000, but there are some parts of inner cities where it's more like 50 or 60 in 100,000. In Mexico, it's 27 in 100,000. In El Salvador, it used to be, I think, the highest in the world at like 60 or 70, and now it's 2. So, you're trying to make a generalized statement about immigration and crime. I don't think the data's there on which to base that statement, and I think the variables are so huge that any final judgment that you made wouldn't be all that helpful. For example, a lot of the crime that we're seeing now is being committed by people from Venezuela, young men from Venezuela, some of them associated with the Tren de Aragua and other criminal groups. I wonder if the Chinese, who've come in to the tune of maybe 50,000 in the last year, if the rate of criminality is anywhere near that in that community. I don't know. But I would imagine that the rate of crimes committed by people either before they came here or after they got in would vary tremendously, as it does in the U.S., by age, sex, and other background factors.
I try in these conversations to not to steel man as many sides of an argument as possible, because I think it's actually just a healthy practice to be able to be a thoughtful person and to model that to people. There is a strong claim that you could make, which is to say, what's happening now, this enormous level of essentially black market activity that is the illegal immigration, and the unwillingness to do anything about it or to actually encourage it, is a kind of radical social policy. It's a kind of backdoor way to stoke revolution in the country. And I mean revolution in the sense of fundamental transformation of the norms and institutions and rules of the road of the society, and to not do it through making a persuasive argument to the public, the voting public, but to just bring in a bunch of new people, some of whom may really fundamentally have radically different views about what a good society should be. Do you think that that's going on, or is that a position that is just sort of scaremongering and sort of just a straw man that, the people that, whether it's the Biden administration or whatever, but the people who want all this mass immigration, they just want to destroy the country? Do you think is there any truth to that at all, or is that just simply an unfair statement?
Well, there is some truth to it. I mean, I've always given 3 reasons for why mass immigration is encouraged by the left in general. One is ideology. They actually believe in abolition. If you read the statements of the organizers of the BLM protests, for example, they believe that there should be no carceral state. It's the Angela Davis line from the 60s. People should not be arrested and they should not be sent to jail. And therefore, you should have no enforcement of border laws, right? Borders are artificial. They're, racist. People should be able to go wherever they want, whenever they want. So that's one reason. Another is electoral advantage. I think there's some cynical people who believe that that a majority of those coming into this country illegally will end up voting for one party, presumably the Democratic Party. And then I think there's an element of extortion to it where they feel like if they set the facts on the ground as we've got 10 million people let in, what are you going to do about it? That they'll put themselves in a better position to try to bargain to cut a deal. I try to be charitable. I mean, I do think that communists like Angela Davis and Patrisse Cullors and others actually do want to restructure society. They say it right up front. They say they hate capitalism. Mm-hmm. They hate the history and the traditions of the United States, and they want to rebuild it, break it down and rebuild it in a different way. In the same way that, Israel would be fundamentally rebuilt if we had a rivers to the sea, ceasefire and everybody was living amongst each other. We would see that country radically reshaped, and maybe not in a way that would be in U.S. national interests. I still think they're a minority. I think there's an awful lot of people on the other side of this debate from me who are they're well-meaning, but perhaps naive. They don't really understand what the demand is. They say, well, why can't we let everybody in? We've got plenty of room. They've never been anywhere, and they don't actually know how many people would come and just how difficult it would be to absorb them all. I was a teacher many years ago, and if you have a class of 20 kids and you've got 2 or 3 with learning disabilities or special needs or who don't speak English, it usually works out. By the end of the year, those kids, they're acting like the other kids, or you've managed to deal with whatever special needs they have. But if you have a class of 20 and 10 of them don't speak English, you're not going to make the same progress in that class. So I think there is a limit to the speed of assimilation, to the percentages that you can have in a given community. Fundamentally, my objection to open borders is that I believe in the rule of law. I believe that what holds this country together, what makes it a country people want to come to, is that we have laws and we respect them. And when I see the justice system being twisted to carry out political aims on either side, that upsets me. And when I see our immigration law as written and passed into law by Congress being ignored by the executive branch, that upsets me too. I don't have a problem if Congress passes a law that I completely object to. I'll suck it up because that's the way the game is played. But what we're seeing now is that we have laws, as I mentioned, passed in 96 was the last big reform, that were intended to achieve a certain goal. And for political reasons, this administration, this president decided they wanted to get around it through executive actions that are being challenged in court. And that isn't the rule of law that all these people are fleeing, Venezuela and Cuba to come to.
You said yourself that you are an immigrant to this country. And you're obviously a well-traveled person, and I think, by all accounts, I'd say you are you have a reasonable view of these things that we could disagree about on this or that, but I think you've been very charitable with the other side, which I think is important. I ask every guest, because we call this show "Dad Saves America" for a reason. I think we as men I think, can embrace the role of dad in a way that's profound for the country, starting with how we raise our kids, how we engage in our community, and then the country writ large. How do you think of your role in the American story?
Wow. Well, I was privileged to be able to serve my country for 23 years in Africa 3 times, Asia twice, Europe twice. I only did 3 years back in the U.S. in those 23 years. And I gave a lot of talks about civil rights, about U.S. history, and I had a lot of time to kind of refine what I thought made us different, and in many cases better from other societies. And I have always seen my mission as the pursuit of truth. My high school motto, I always thought was really dumb at the time, whatsoever things are true. It's a passage from the Bible. I think it's Matthew, but don't quote me on that. And I now understand what it meant. It just boils down to a search for the truth that is the core of Western civilization. That is the science. That is philosophy. That is what it's all about, is that we build on the steps and the achievements of our ancestors to try to get wiser and smarter and learn how to live better and more valuable lives and more useful lives. And so I try to keep that channel open. I try to encourage, whenever I talk to young people, them to speak openly, to have opinions, share them respectfully, but never have taboo subjects that they can't discuss. So I think freedom of speech and open debate is what I'm all about.
Awesome. Thanks for being on Dad Saves America.
Thank you.